What's up, y'all? Welcome to Wednesdays in the Word. I'm Tamise, and I'll be with Alex going through our Mount on Campus initiatives. We're super excited. So on Wednesdays at 8 p.m., we'll be doing a little Bible study, and then on Fridays at 12:30 p.m., we'll be doing a digital kickback, and that's a place for us to really have an informal conversation about God, about life in college, and I'll be there with you guys live on Zoom. So we hope that you'll check that out. But anyway, welcome to Wednesdays in the Word. As I was thinking about what to share as this first series, I've been thinking about the time that we're living in right now and how much of a wilderness dry season a lot of us are in. And so what I thought would be a good title for the series is Mysterious Ways, How God Leads Us Through the Wilderness. So we're actually going to pick a text today from the Old Testament. It's from the book of Deuteronomy, and it's in chapter 8. And we're going to go from verses 1 to 7. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, 1-7, Moses is telling the people before they enter into the promised land why it is they had to go through what they had to go through. And as I was reading this passage and praying for the Mount on Campus, I was thinking about, let's look at these 5 things that particularly come out of this passage that it seems like God does for them in the wilderness, and it's probably true that God does it for us in the wilderness as well. So what I'm going to do is read the passage, and then we'll break it down verse by verse. Let's jump in. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 1-7. Be careful to obey all the commands I'm giving you today. Then you will live and multiply, and you will enter and occupy the land the Lord your God swore to give your ancestors. Remember how the Lord your God led you through the wilderness for these 40 days, humbling you and testing you to prove your character, and to find out whether or not you would obey his commands. Yes, he humbled you by letting you go hungry and then feeding you with manna, a food previously unknown to you or your ancestors. And he did it to teach you that people do not live by bread alone. Rather, we live by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. For all these 40 years, your clothes didn't wear out, your feet didn't blister or swell. Think about it. Just as a parent disciplines a child, the Lord your God disciplines you for your own good. So obey the commands of the Lord your God by walking in his ways and fearing him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land of flowing streams and pools of water, with fountains and springs that gush out in the valleys and hills. So the first thing that we need to know about the wilderness in Scripture is that it's not the woods. A lot of times when we think about the wilderness in our contemporary understanding, we think of a forest picture or something that looks like the woods behind our house. But that's not what's going on here in Scripture. For Israel, the wilderness was the desert. So there are all kinds of beasts, all kinds of animals, all kinds of dangers. There are thieves and robbers. It's a very dangerous place to go through the wilderness. And so what Moses is doing in this passage is setting it up for them. And first of all, what he does is he says that God has given us a promise. So the first thing that we know about the wilderness season is that it is always preceded by a promise. Look at verse 1. Be careful to obey the commands I'm giving you today. Then you will live and multiply, and you will enter and occupy the land the Lord swore to give your ancestors. The wilderness is always preceded by a promise. I know that none of us were expecting 2020 to look the way it looks, but that doesn't mean that the promises of God are void. It means that we need to remind ourselves of what God has promised us and what he has called us to. And what happens when we walk through a desert season is we take those promises of God with us. And they serve as a kind of fuel for us and a kind of strengthening agent to get us through. And so what Moses does right off the bat is say, wait a minute, if you're going to go through the wilderness, you have to know that I will never send you through the wilderness without a promise first. And so God reminds them of what he told them when they left the land of Egypt. Number 2, the wilderness is a proving ground. Look at what verse 2 says. Remember how the Lord led you through the wilderness for these 40 years, humbling you and testing you to prove your character and to find out whether or not you would obey his commands. So the wilderness is a place where God puts us in a situation where our character is exposed, our secret thoughts are exposed, where our impatience and our ways of being are exposed. I don't know about you, but I'm not liking everything that I see in the midst of this season. But what pressure and what a wilderness does is it causes all of that stuff to come to the surface so that we can deal with it. And so what Moses is telling Israel is part of the reason you can't enter the promised land yet, and part of the reason God took us through the wilderness was to show us what was in us so that when we got to the promised land, we could actually appreciate it and we could be fruitful. And so for some of us, the wilderness is a proving ground where God is showing us what's on the inside of us and wanting to deal with things that might not have ever been exposed had we not been in the season of 2020 like we're in right now. Thirdly, the wilderness prepares our palate. Let me tell you a quick story first. So one of my favorite things to do with my girlfriends is to go to wine tastings. And the first time I ever went to a wine tasting, the gentleman brought out a white dish with some pink stringy stuff that smelled very weird. And I was very confused because we're at a wine tasting, so I don't understand why I have this pink stringy stuff. But it turns out, as he told me, that this is ginger, and what ginger does is it actually cleanses our palate so that we can actually taste the difference in the wines. And what it does is it helps us to appreciate the finer types of wines. It also helps those wines from mingling in with each other so that we can't tell the difference. And so when Moses tells the people that God led you this way to make you hunger, he's telling them that essentially he's cleansing their spiritual palate. Look at verse 3. He humbled you by letting you go hungry and then feeding you with manna, a food that was previously unknown to you and to your ancestors. And he did it to teach you that people don't live by bread alone. Rather, we live by the words that come out of God's mouth. And so what Moses is trying to tell the people is like, you actually couldn't appreciate the finer things. God had manna in store for us, but we were still eating Wonder Bread. And so what God has to do is take you through this wilderness season so that you can hunger and thirst and realize that what you've been eating and drinking is actually not sustaining you, right? A lot of us have been eating junk food. And what we've found in this season is that we're malnourished, that we don't actually have the strength and the capacity to handle what's happening right now. And that's the purpose for the wilderness. It cleanses our palate. In the same way, they were coming out of Egypt, so they were used to a certain way of doing things, a certain way of being, and God says, I'm not going to allow that to get mixed in with what I'm about to do. We need to cleanse that palate so that you can appreciate the finer things that I'm going to give you. And so fourthly, what the wilderness does is it produces gratitude. Now look what Moses tells them to do. He says, for all these 40 years, your clothes didn't wear out and your feet didn't blister or swell. And he says, think about it. And I love that because what he's telling them to do is slow down and think about what God has done. You may have been in the wilderness. You might even be in the wilderness, but it doesn't mean that God has not been moving. And so what Moses tells them to do before they move to the next season is think about what God has already done. He's provided for you. He's made a way for you. And so what we find is that the wilderness is also a time for us to contemplate and for it to produce gratitude in our hearts. And we can't enter into a promise without gratitude. That precedes everything. And so what Moses is saying to do is think about it. Think about what God has done before we go into this next season. And you know what? 2020 is not going to be here forever, y'all. We're almost done. We got a few months left, and I'm praying, just like I know you're praying, that 2021 is a whole new mood because I can't take anymore. But I also am trying to think about things that God has done in this season, and whether it's what I've learned about myself, whether it's being reminded and having to draw my heart back to the promises of God, whether it's realizing that I've been eating junk food and my spirit is malnourished, I'm thankful for those things. I need to think about those things because when we go into the next season, we're going to need to carry all of that with us. And then lastly, my favorite, Moses says, just as a parent disciplines a child, your Lord disciplines you for your own good. So the last thing that I noticed about the wilderness is that the wilderness is good parenting. And one of the verses that came up for me as I thought about this was Hebrews chapter 12, verse 7. Let's go there really quickly. Look at Hebrews and what Hebrews says about God as our Father. It says, as you endure divine discipline, remember that God is treating you as his children. Who ever heard of a child who is never disciplined by his father? And if God doesn't discipline you as he does all his children, then you are illegitimate. And you're not really his children at all. So since we respected our earthly fathers who disciplined us, shouldn't we submit even more to the discipline of the Father of our spirits and live forever? So what Moses is saying is that the wilderness was a place for God to show you that more than anything, he's a father. Now, how do I know that? Well, if you read through the Exodus, what you'll find is that as Israel wanders through the wilderness, they are led by a pillar of cloud by day and by fire by night. So what's the significance of that? And how does this point to God as a parent? Well, what's interesting is, like I said, the wilderness is not a forest. There's no shade, right? No shade. But there's also no places for them to go and hide from the sun. And at night, there are all kinds of animals, right? And it's very, very cold in the wilderness. And so what God does is at nighttime leads them with a fire. He basically is a portable heater that leads them through the wilderness and keeps them warm, keeps them from freezing. That's something that a good father would do. And in the daytime, in the reverse, in the desert, it's extremely hot. And so what does God do? He leads them with a cloud. He covers them from the heat of the sun to keep them cool and to keep them healthy. Now, these things are pointing to God as a good parent. And Israel would have never, ever learned these things had they not gone through the wilderness. And I actually suspect that we wouldn't have learned these things if we hadn't been going through the wilderness ourselves. So let me challenge you this week. Think through these 5, right? That the wilderness is preceded by a promise, that the wilderness is a proving ground, that the wilderness prepares our spiritual palate, that the wilderness produces gratitude, and that the wilderness is about good parenting. And as you think about this week, which one of those 5 is really sticking out to you? Take some time to write about that, to tweet about that, to journal about that. Make sure that you hashtag the Mount on Campus, Wednesdays in the Word, and make sure that you join us on Friday so we can talk more about this live and in person. Thank you guys for coming to Wednesdays in the Word. I'm really blessed to be with you all. And next time we're going to talk about 3 different characters who actually have these things showing up in their lives in the scriptures. Thank you so much. Grace and peace. Thank you.